welcome to the two of you. John Whittingdale, you're supporting Boris Johnson. We are going to talk about Brexit. Steve Barclay has been questioned by the Brexit Committee.
And by me.
And by you.
I'm the Vice Chairman of the Committee.
Thank you very much for filling in my sentences. And Steve Barclay said, under questioning then from you and others, that no deal is underpriced. What does he mean?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things which I found a bit frustrating this morning was his saying to us that the EU is not really focusing on preparations to reach agreements in specific areas, etc., if we were unable to get a comprehensive deal, because they still think there is a chance that the Prime Minister's deal could go through. I think what is very clear is that whoever becomes Prime Minister next week, the Prime Minister's deal is not going to go through. And so I hope we can still get a different deal, but we need to start looking at all the options very quickly.
Right, so you do still think there's a chance of a negotiated deal. If you listen to Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, and particularly Boris Johnson, he's putting no deal front and centre of his strategy. It doesn't look like there's any real intention to get a negotiated deal.
No, I don't think that's true at all.
Is that not the strategy?
Boris Johnson has always made clear that he would prefer to have a deal, not the one that the Prime Minister brought forward, which was clearly never going to work. But yes, we would like to get a deal. And one of the ways in which you increase the pressure in order to get a satisfactory outcome is by keeping the no-deal option on the table.
Right, but if the backstop is being ditched, the one thing that the EU insists must be there as an insurance policy if you never actually agree a free trade agreement further down the line, then what sort of negotiated deal are you looking at?
Well, I always thought that putting the negotiation around what happens on the Irish border into the withdrawal agreement was a mistake, because it is a part of the future trading arrangements. What happens at the Northern Ireland border will be very much influenced by what trading agreement we reach, and therefore it should be considered as a part of that discussion. And that's what Boris has suggested. You put it into the overall negotiation on our future trading agreement.
So you're looking at a longer, if you like, transition period that could be anything up to 5 years while you agree the full free trade agreement?
Oh, I don't think it would be 5 years.
How many years?
Well, we had previously had a proposal from the government that we would negotiate it in the implementation period, as it was then called, which would run until the end of December 2020.
But this would go longer. If you were doing the full thing...
No, the transition period was in order to get a full trading agreement.
Right,
and,
and in that time we would say part of the EU, we would pay money to the EU, and we would still be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
That was what was proposed.
Under Boris Johnson's plan?
If we can leave on the 31st of October, and then, for a limited period, get a future trading agreement, then yes.
Right. I mean, Amber Rudd has said, she is now saying that no deal does have to be kept on the table in some way, even if she doesn't like it, but she says you're going to collide with reality when you get into the negotiations.
Well, I don't believe that's the case. I think part of the problem is that the European Union has been clinging on to the hope, maybe encouraged by the present Prime Minister, that somehow her deal could be ratified. I think next week it will be, the real reality will dawn, which is that the deal is dead, and we need to get a different type of deal, and hopefully can do it very quickly.
What do you think the strategy is here? The backstop is being ditched. Theresa May's deal is dead. The EU have said no to all these sorts of things being negotiated. What is Boris Johnson's strategy other than heading for no deal?
Well, I think John has just outlined his strategy pretty well. What the question, I think, is that going to work? I just don't see why the EU would give in that much at all. What Boris Johnson's strategy, if John, you're right, is saying that we have a blind Brexit on the problem of Ireland. And the EU, given their dedication to the unity of the EU 27, is not going to let Ireland or Leo Varadkar just float out there. The EU will want to know what's going to go on with Ireland before they agree to any transition deal, 5 years or not. So I just would like to know how Boris Johnson would force the EU's hand in this. And before this week, Joe, as we were saying, had there been compromise on a backstop, I think EU might have gone that far.
On a time limit,
on an exit mechanism. But even that was pushing it quite a lot. And now ditching the backstop entirely, ditching the deal entirely, I find a very difficult task.
Well, as is very clear from the votes, 3 of them in Parliament, the deal in its present form is never going to pass. The reality is, and I think this will focus minds...
But how do you make... Well, you say it might focus minds, but
what will focus minds is that the 31st of October, Britain is leaving the European Union. We would prefer to have an agreement by then, but the alternative is no deal. And in terms of Leo Varadkar and the consequences for the Northern Irish border, a no deal would be very damaging, and Leo Varadkar knows that.
I think they would call that bluff. Obviously it would be hugely damaging for Ireland if a hard border was to be erected. But at the same time, it could be hugely damaging for us as well at the port of Calais and Dover. So, we're playing with fire here, and I think the EU would call that bluff if you were asking them to go into blind Brexit.
And I think John and Boris Johnson are both perfectly aware of this. These deals are pure unicorn poo. They're not going to wash at all. It's just utterly, it's obfuscation, it's confusion. We're going to end up with a no deal. And that I think, for some people, has been the game plan all along, because this has never been about UK independence. This has been about breaking out of the orbit of the EU in order to become a satellite of the US. And that has, for a very long time, has been absolutely central to the policy of people like yourself. And there's no mystery. There's no mystery as to why this is, because that means, as we'll find out as soon as we try to negotiate a trade deal with the US, it'll mean downward pressure on wages, downward pressure on public protections, downward pressure on taxes.
Let's focus on the deal at hand. You're saying it's nonsense. Which
well, I think
nonsense?
George's claim that this is somehow also that we can become another member of the United States is clearly ridiculous.
But is it that people would prefer no deal? There will be some members of your campaign team, or Boris Johnson's campaign team, who always wanted no deal.
Very, very few people would actually want no deal. I have one or two colleagues who have said it publicly. You know, on the select committee with me, Chris Chope, Peter Bone maybe, have said that they like the idea. But for most people, we would much prefer to have an agreement.
But John, you
it's
know
in both sides' interests to get one, and I still think it's possible.
Well, my question is, where's your mandate for no deal?
Well, the mandate is 17.4 million people who voted to
no
leave.
deal?
No, they voted to leave the European Union.
Right.
That is what we are delivering. And actually, the frustration in the British public is that 3 years on, we haven't left
Well,
yet.
actually, is there a mandate? Because let's show our viewers and you this Vote Leave leaflet, which was distributed at the time of the campaign. And there is a bit there towards the bottom that says, taking back control is a careful change, not a sudden stop. We will negotiate the terms of a new deal before we start any legal process to leave. That's not no deal.
Well, as I say, I would prefer to have a deal if we can possibly get one. It was always the intention. But the mandate is to leave the European Union. And you say no deal. I mean, actually, it was made clear by the Remain argument throughout the entire campaign that leaving the European Union meant leaving it in totality.
Yes, leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, but not without a deal. I mean, Annalise, is that where we're heading now, towards no deal?
Well, I'm very concerned that it could be, and quite frankly, I hear the kind of discussion that we're just having now, and I despair because the impact of no deal on people's living standards could be very significant. I mean, we know it could push up the cost of food, for example. It could threaten many jobs across our country. And quite frankly, this is being dangled for ideological reasons, and I'm afraid it is because some do see this as a potential way to open up questions about regulation, to open up those systems that we've had that protect us, you know, food quality, everything else. And I think it's completely illegitimate when, as you said, this was not what was offered to the British public.
Well, it's not what your colleague Sarah Champion, the Labour MP sitting here yesterday, said. Let's have a listen to her.
I want us to leave, the country wants us to leave, and for our democracy, I think we have to leave. So therefore, if it came to it, I would take no deal if that meant we could leave, because we have to leave.
But
and
you just said you prefer to do no deal than not leave at all.
Yeah.
But you weren't prepared to vote for the deal that you had the chance to vote for 3 times. I really don't understand that.
Well, because it's poker, isn't it? And if I'm being completely honest, I hoped she would listen to what the Labour front bench was saying and would move, and she didn't.
Well, I have a lot of respect for Sarah, and she's right that unfortunately we didn't see any compromise coming from the Conservative side, which I regret. But I don't think, no, it wasn't a game of poker, and actually that's why, one of many reasons why I really reject this analysis that somehow this is just, a game of poker, a game of chicken, and one side's going to blink.
That is what it was. You see, you respect her views, and Sarah said very clearly yesterday, the underline. Well, let me just, because viewers may not have watched yesterday, I'm sure they did, but Sarah Champion was saying very clearly that Labour thought it was a game, they would get their best deal. And now she's prepared to back no deal.
Yeah, so if I can just finish what I was trying to say about that, I think Sarah is wrong on this issue. She may be right on other ones, but not on this, because she seems to be presenting no deal as in some way a kind of clean break. So, you know, we have no deal and then we go on with dealing with everything else that might concern her constituents. The problem is, if we have no deal, not only will we have all that economic dislocation and impact on people's living standards, but we will have 10 or 20 years more of this wrangling. We'll have more wrangling about what the deal would be with the EU. You know, it's just been mentioned, what, 5 years, 10 years, how long will it take to work out the future trade deal, plus with the US, plus with every other country?
Right. But the problem is, for you, is it's not just Sarah Champion. There are other Labour MPs, including Caroline Flint, who will back no deal over no Brexit. So you may disagree, and you do disagree, in terms of what it might mean for constituents. But in terms of the mathematics of trying to stop no deal, you've got people on your side who are now openly discussing backing the government pursuing no deal rather than their Labour Party backing a no confidence motion.
That's right, there is a small number, and I'm sure you would agree it is a small number, of Labour MPs who take that view.
And what do you think?
I don't think they're correct in taking that view because, as I said, I think some of them feel this would enable some kind of an end to this issue. It will not be an end to this issue. It will actually prolong it. And I think lots of people watching this programme will be asking, why are we talking about Brexit yet again? If we have no deal, we're going to have 10 more years of this at least.
It was one of the most depressing things I've seen this year. Sarah championed yesterday on TV, and I've seen a lot of depressing things this year. Poker. It's like this country is just a pile of chips to be gambled with. It's outrageous. It's extraordinary too that, the Labour Party, as Annalise says, is meant to stand up for the working people of this country. They are going to be shafted by no deal Brexit. It's going to be great for the people that John represents. It's going to be terrible for the people that Labour represents.
John?
Well, I don't think that's the case. I think that the damage has been exaggerated. I think we have a time now in which we can make preparation. One of the things that's disturbed me is that I don't think there has been enough work done to prepare, both within government and outside. And actually, in response to George, I represent a rural constituency. Yes, my farmers are concerned about the consequences of tariffs, but I actually think we can avoid those tariffs being put in place. I asked Stephen Barclay this morning about GAP 24, which does allow us to continue zero tariffs if the EU agree.
Yes, but as you say, only if the EU agreed, and they have said up until now they wouldn't.
No, they haven't.
Well, Sir Ian Wayand was very clear, saying that they wouldn't.
Well, I asked Steve Barclay whether the government had actually asked for it, and he said no.
But talking of which, would you ask for an extension? Would Boris Johnson ask for an extension in the way Ursula von der Leyen says she's prepared to give?
No, Boris Johnson's made it absolutely clear we have to leave on the 31st of October.
All right, let's talk about John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, and remind you what he's been talking about this morning.
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation said last year, and I quote, that in-work poverty is the problem of our time. 2/3 of the children in poverty live in a working family. And that's before billions of pounds of more cuts to work age benefits that the government have planned. I'm committing today to ending this modern day scourge. I'm committing to eliminating in-work poverty by the end of Labour's first full parliamentary term.
Annalise, John McDonnell pledging a 5-year plan to end in-work poverty, I should say. How do you measure that?
Well, we can measure it very easily, actually. We have the statistics. They're very, very clear that when you look at relative poverty levels in particular, there's actually been an increase in absolute poverty as well, but when you look at those relative poverty statistics, you see that 2/3 of children living in that kind of poverty are actually in households where at least one parent is working.
Right.
It's a very, very new thing. That has not occurred in this country for many, many decades, so we've got to deal with it.
Right, so 8 million families we're talking about, is that the sort of figure?
Yes, I believe that is correct.
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation
Yep.
does actually say 8 million live in families where at least one person live in work. So you are going to alleviate that relative poverty for 8 million families, 14 million people in 5 years.
We think that we can build on actually the very positive record that Labour had in government before. First of all, through structural measures that deal with this. Well, it was, but actually it showed that when you really focus on child poverty, which I don't think many people would disagree that the Labour governments did do, actually you can have a very significant impact. And we saw that particularly severe poverty for children was reduced over that period. How did we do it? We've got to build on it now. First, we've got to have measures to make sure that when people get into work, they're not then still immiserated. Very new things, I said, happening under the Conservatives. We've got to deal with that with a decent living wage, for example. We've got to have decent social services, and we've got to have decent support for people.
And all I'm saying is, can you really
security.
do that in 5 years? Cindy, do you think that is possible?
Well, I think the policies that John McDonnell raises are going to be very interesting to break apart and really have a look at, do they really encourage economic growth at the same time as lifting those out of poverty? Because you can't just funnel money into it and not expect inflation or other problems to come about. And just talking about the Conservatives as well, unemployment has been falling under the Conservative government, and it's it's absolutely a problem that even though unemployment is falling and we still have in-work poverty, absolutely recognise the problem, but 5 years is a heck of a short time.
It is a short time, but we've got to recognise the impact on those children for the rest of their lives if we accept this current situation. And sadly, we're seeing currently many, many cases where children's parents are working incredibly hard, often on 0 hours contracts, for example, which Labour said we'd ban, often earning less than £10 an hour, which again Labour said that we would deal with without that support from social security. That'll have an impact on them for the rest of their lives that we'll have to live with.
Will it be the end of food banks in 5 years?
Well, I would hope that it would be. Obviously, we've seen their use increase massively. There's a number of drivers for that.
Sure.
Part of that is to do with
Do
sanctioning.
you think you should pledge to get rid of food banks in 5 years as part of that?
Well, personally, I wouldn't want to ever get rid of them if they're providing a service that people might need. But I think the drivers for their use, hopefully, will dry up under Labour. Because, for example, we won't be saying to people they won't get any support at all for months because of a decision that's been made by a job centre official, which I just don't think is right.
Let's move on to George's report, which we talked very briefly about earlier, because this is about asset wealth. It was commissioned by Labour to look at asset wealth and perhaps how it should be taxed and a fairer system. Can you give us the sort of headline recommendations of that report?
So we're looking at the use and control of land as a crucial political issue which has been massively neglected for a long time. We want to see much more strategic use for public spaces, for housing, particularly social housing, which is greatly lacking, stronger constraints on landlords who can't treat their tenants like footballs to just kick around as they wish, stronger environmental controls to improve the quality of public space, to improve environmental quality on farmland. It's quite a long list, but it could radically transform greatly for the better life in this country.
Have you been surprised by the reaction to your recommendations?
It's been quite a reaction. We've had, it must be 60, 70 articles now in the billionaire press laying into it, much of which are completely fictitious. So, for instance, one of the main lines of attack has been, we want to impose capital gains tax on main residences. We don't. Pure fiction. In fact, we look at that in the report, we examine the case for, the case against, and then we come down saying we're not going to do it. So the entire billionaire press says we're going to do it. So it gives us a very strong indication, actually. You know, one of our...
Well, what about the inheritance tax proposals, though? Because that has, and will, even from the Labour side, cause some consternation. This idea that up to £125,000 you can have tax-free, but beyond that you would be taxed as income.
This isn't inheritance tax. This is a lifetime gift tax. We're talking about changing the system radically from an inheritance tax to a lifetime gift tax. Now, if you want to give your money to several people, and you stay under that threshold for each of those people of below £125,000, then you find you can give it away tax-free.
Right. Do you like the sound of that,
if you want to dump all this on one person, you can't.
I mean, I think there's a lot of very interesting ideas in this report.
What about that one specifically?
Well, I think we do need to look very carefully at whether inheritance tax in particular is delivering and whether another system might be necessary. Currently, less than 4% of estates pay inheritance tax, obviously not people because they've died, estates, and yet the public perception is that huge numbers of people are paying this. There's numerous ways of getting out of paying
would you adopt that policy?
so the very best off people can get out of it. Would we? Well, we're certainly looking at ways in which the system could be redesigned to be fairer, because currently, if you're very, very well off, you can work out ways to avoid paying inheritance tax.
I understand the arguments,
isn't fair.
but you commissioned Georgia Monbiot to do this report and come forward with recommendations. Are you actually going to adopt any of them, particularly that one about lifetime gifts?
As I think you know, we're a democratic party, so when it comes up to general elections, we look at our policies in the round. We have a whole policy-making process. George's suggestions and those of his co-authors will be fed into that, as well as those of our stakeholders, businesses that I've talked to about this, accountants that I've talked to about this. You know, there's widespread acknowledgement that inheritance tax is not working and that land is not taxed fairly, so we do need to do something about it.
I'd like to welcome Laura Kunsberg, our political editor. Cindy, listening to this policy, particularly the one around lifetime gifts, we had Sarah Jones, who a Labour MP, part of the shadow cabinet, I think certainly a shadow cabinet spokesperson, saying George is a very interesting person, came up with a lot of interesting ideas, which we'll look at, but they are not Labour policy at this point on any level. Does that fill you with some dread that they're going to take on any of these?
That's simply a statement of fact. I mean, these are proposals...
You're an interesting person.
That goes without saying, but these are proposals to the Labour Party. They're not, at this time, Labour policy, despite what you might be reading in the newspapers owned by billionaires.
Do you like the sound of any of these proposals?
Well, I mean, I agree we need more social housing, and I'd be interested in some of the environmental proposals, and I'm delighted to hear George actually say that he's not proposing to impose capital gains tax on the main home. But on the specific proposal of lifetime gifts, I'm horrified, and I think a huge number of people would be, because for a lot of people, particularly those with children who are struggling to afford the first home, and parents want to help, and the idea if you give your child a helping hand, you then have to pay a massive tax bill on top of that, seems to me deeply unfair.
A helping hand? We're talking about a threshold of £125,000.
It's a lot of money.
Well,
Not to get a house in the country,
actually, house prices today, that's not going to get you a house.
No, but the idea, you see, this is so interesting, because you claim to be the party of social mobility, the party of meritocracy, the party of opportunity, and yet, when it comes down to it, you're really the party of just passing on huge chunks of money to people who haven't actually had to work for it because they happen to have been born to the right families.
Well, no, because I believe that parents have the right, if I have earned a lot of money, then I want to support my children. I don't want to hand it over to the taxpayer.
There'll be a lot more discussion
on... What it creates is a highly unequal society of inheritors rather than an enterprise society.
All right, we're going to move on to Prime Minister's questions, because it is the last PMQs for Theresa May as Conservative leader, not as Prime Minister. She will, of course, do that next Wednesday. So, how will it feel?
Well, I'm not sure, really.
No.
I worry for our viewers, perhaps, that it might feel actually, as it has sometimes in the last few weeks, just rather a bit of a non-event and a bit empty. A lot of the benches have been very empty because lots of MPs just haven't been turning up because they feel that it's not necessarily something of much consequence. But there are, of course, lots of enormous issues to be raised. And I wonder also if we might see more on the ongoing questions about what really happened in terms of the row about our departing now American Ambassador Sir Kim Darroch. It may well be there's some rather pointed questions on that whole saga. I'm not sure for Jeremy Corbyn where he will focus his questions this week. Awkward, isn't it? Because he's about to face after the summer a different person across the dispatch box, and I think next week will feel almost a bit like a strange political leaving do of a sort. So it's probably Jeremy Corbyn's last chance to make a big political point against Theresa May. Well, I think next week will feel altogether.
Well, and you feel sort of ambivalent about what the atmosphere is like. Let's have a look inside. In fact, Theresa May just being greeted there by the Speaker coming in. I think we can show our viewers that it is pretty empty. I mean, it has been a little bit like that the last few weeks. If not empty, then certainly some empty spaces there. John, has it felt like that it's sort of fizzling out?
Well, I mean, Prime Minister's questions is the sort of big event of the week, but when you know that the Prime Minister answering the questions isn't actually going to be there in a few weeks' time, and obviously what she says is of less importance. And I think, you know, looking at the pictures there, previously everybody rushed in to reserve a seat for PM's questions. You put a little card in, say, this is my seat. There's a lot of empty green benches there today. So I'm afraid the reality is that people do appear no longer to see it as attractive and important. That will change, I suspect, once we have the new Prime Minister.